All right. Good afternoon to everyone again, and thanks for joining and for making time to join our SAEON Seminar series. Today's speaker is Dr. Helga van Coller. Helga is one of our NRF professional PDP Professional Development Program research fellows working through the SAEON Ndlovu node. She's been with us just over a year, working through the palatable node, and she joins us from the Unit of Environmental Science and Management at Northwest University. Helga completed her undergrad training in botany, zoology, and tourism at Northwest, and then continued with her postgrad studies at Northwest, during which time she explored community-level dynamics of herbaceous vegetation in savannas. As a postgrad, she was a member of the Forb Ecology Research Group, which aims to improve our understanding of ecology of grasslands and savannas, in particular to disturbance events and global change effects. At the moment, Helga retains her links to that group, and she's also supervising some students there. As you will see from today's presentation, Helga is madly passionate about flowering plants, and her research not only highlights a really critical gap in our understanding around the value of forbs, but also highlights some of the work that she's been doing over the past decade that's really pushing this field of study forward in South Africa. So yeah, just to remind you that this is going to be recorded. And over to you, Helga. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that warm welcome, Dave. And also for the opportunity for me to share with you some of the knowledge that I have gained through my postgraduate studies, but not only that, but also more importantly, my love and passion and appreciation for a less studied and understood but ecologically important plant life form. And therefore, this afternoon, I will be talking to you about the importance of forb in semi-arid savanna conservation, management, and research. Okay, so although all of the biomes in South Africa have forbs in their vegetation layer, my passion and most of my experience lies within the savanna biome, which stretches across various of the country's provinces, and particularly the Limpopo and Mpumalanga provinces, where most of my fieldwork has been done, and also fieldwork of some of my fellow students took place. So as you've noticed in my title, I refer to semi-arid savannas. Now, these are savannas that are characterized by an annual rainfall of below 650 millimeters. They are considered water-limited systems, of which the primary productivity or the total amount of organic material produced by plants interacts strongly with rainfall. And rainfall is therefore considered one of the primary drivers of the vegetation structure of semi-arid savannas, and particularly of the herbaceous layer. So a semi-arid savanna can therefore be defined as a savanna with a strongly seasonal and water-limited plant communities, consisting of a relatively continuous herbaceous layer, which contains forbs and grasses, and then a discontinuous woody component. And that is what I tried to illustrate in this picture over here, where we can see the relatively continuous herbaceous layer consisting of the grass species, and then also the flowering forb species, and then the discontinuous layer of woody vegetation. So identifying the mechanisms that allow trees and grasses to coexist in savannas without the one life form outcompeting the other is one of the most widely discussed topics in savanna ecology. And although a lot of research has been done on this topic and we know a lot about it, one of the key focus areas of my research is and has been to try and disentangle the dynamic coexistence between forbs and grasses in savanna ecosystems, because we know that forbs and grasses co-dominate, and often switch dominance in response to different environmental conditions. So I've been talking a lot about forbs and grasses, and I know that we all know what grasses are, but what exactly is a forb? And I think the general term that most of you might have heard before is a wildflower. But forbs constitute a plant life form that can include any non-graminoid vascular plant with mostly herbaceous above ground plant parts and limited woody tissues. Now, for the just to break down this definition for the non-ecologists, non-graminoid refers to herbaceous flowering plants that are non-graminoid, whilst graminoid refers to two life forms, grasses and sedges. And then a herbaceous plant is any vascular plant with limited woody tissues. I wanted to include this slide just to share with you some of my favorite forb species, and just to highlight the different types of forbs that we get. We get succulent or fat forbs, we get thin forbs, we get forbs that grow upright, we get forbs that grow close to the ground. Some are hairy, others are not, and some even might have spines. So, for example, in Barleria elegans, you can see this spiny bract at the base of the very lovely white flower. Formalina africana, where you can notice the very hairy leaves that they have together with the yellow flowers. Then we've got a succulent, Portulaca campesina, with a lovely pink flower. Ruelia cordata, which grows erect or upright with the purple flowers. Then we've got Blephorus integrifolia, and if you can also see on the picture, it has a lot of spiny bracts on the plant. And then we've got Tribulus terrestris, which is an example of a prostrate growing forb, or a forb that grows close to the soil surface with the lovely yellow flowers. And then lastly, Justicia flava, also an erect growing forb, and here you can coincidentally see a lovely butterfly sitting on it. Examples of grasses and sedges. So this is just an example of a grazing lawn of Spirobolus nitens. And in this picture, the dominant grass species is Panica maximum. This was taken in the exclosures in the Kruger National Park, where a lot of my postgraduate studies took place. And then this is one of my favorite sedges. Well, just a definition of a sedge, it's a grass-like plant with inconspicuous flowers, and they typically grow in wet soil. So Cyperus rupestris is one of my favorite type of sedges. Yes, so I just wanted to highlight for you some of the challenges when it comes to forbs, and I think that's probably why a lot of you don't even know what they are, or don't even know how important they are in the ecology of savannas and grasslands. Forbs are clearly represented in definitions of savannas and also in ecology in general. Ecological investigations into the role of forbs in savannas and other ecosystems are scarce. Forbs are generally overlooked or simply lumped into a non-grass category in range condition assessments. Only grasses are reported up until species levels, and forbs are just grouped under all remaining herbaceous plants. And then forbs are not considered as a separate functional entity in their own right, and they are often lumped together with grasses in the calculation of herbaceous biomass, cover, and dry matter production. Furthermore, palatable perennial grasses are considered an important and stable food source for livestock in savanna ecosystems, and consequently, assessments of range conditions in savannas and grasslands are largely based on these palatable perennial grass species. So for these reasons, the ecological function of forbs and how they respond to environmental drivers of herbaceous vegetation dynamics such as herbivory, fire, and rainfall variability remain relatively unknown and unexplored. And although more research is needed for us to understand the complete functional identity of forbs and how they respond to disturbances, we do know that they provide a lot of important functions and services. For example, this is some of the work that we published on forb richness, forb and grass richness. And as you can see, we looked at forb richness, forb species richness and grass species richness across various herbivore treatments. And as you can see, the forbs contributed significantly to the species richness of the herbaceous layer, irrespective of the composition of the large herbivores in that system. Even when herbivores were excluded for a long time, forbs still contributed significantly to the species richness. Forbs have a high family diversity, and they form a natural and distinct group of the herbaceous layer. And a lot of forbs are actually toxic to humans and animals. Forbs contribute to about over 60% of the most toxic plants in South Africa, which is quite an important thing to remember in range management. A variety of forbs are used for traditional food items and medicine. They provide forage to various types of herbivores, from insects to megafauna such as elephants and rhinos, and they form a nutritious food class for browsers and mixed feeders, and may constitute an important part of ungulate and cattle diet at certain times of the year, particularly during the drier months. Forbs not only contribute substantially to the species richness of herbaceous layers, but also to the functional richness. So you can see in the same paper, we looked at forb trait richness and grass trait richness. And once again, across all of the herbivore treatments, forbs contributed significantly more to the functional richness of the herbaceous layer. And yes, so functional traits are the morphological, physiological, and phenological traits that affect the growth, reproduction, and survival of a species. So the morphological traits relate to the form or the structure of something. The physiological traits deals with the normal functioning of a living organism, while the phenological traits refers to the timing of cyclical or seasonal biological events, such as flowering time. So those are what functional traits are all about. And then lastly, forbs are important for nutrient cycling in ecosystems, since they contribute substantially to the carbon inputs into the soil and also the accumulation of organic matter. And a lot of forbs are also nitrogen fixers, and they therefore enrich the soil with this essential nutrient. Not only do forbs provide these important functions, they also exhibit various features that enhance their ability to survive under different environmental conditions. And among these, forbs tend to perform better under improved soil conditions, such as increased nutrient availability associated with subcanopy habitats, as well as increased soil nitrogen and moisture content. They are better adapted to shaded microenvironments compared to grasses, so they can persist under dense woody canopies. They resprout rapidly after fire events due to the presence of underground storage organs, which is also considered an important drought adaptive traits and associated with persistent bud banks and viable seed banks. They are resilient under various environmental conditions because they exhibit a variety of morphologies, regeneration strategies, and also functional traits. And many forbs are also symbiotically associated with specific insect species, and they therefore support highly specialized faunal pollinator systems. So despite all of these functions and services provided by forbs, they are still oftentimes associated with land degradation and perceived as being an undesirable functional group by land managers. Even though research has shown that understanding the dynamics and functions of the forb component is essential for the management of the floral diversity in rangelands. So given the functional and ecological importance of the forb component, we should strive to include this understudied life form in range condition assessments of how vegetation responds to various disturbances. And then forbs can also be used as indicator species for indexing these effects on of disturbances on plant assemblages and ecosystem structure and function. So various approaches can be followed to try and address this gap in knowledge, which include increased long-term monitoring of forb abundance, diversity, and phenology. Forbs should be considered as a separate functional entity in their own right when ecological studies are done. Forbs should be included in global definitions and range condition assessments. They should be studied at species and functional trait level, and forb ecology should be studied across various vegetation types and biomes. So who, might you ask, will be able to fill these gaps in the research, and who is ready to accept the challenge? One example of this, as Dave also mentioned in the beginning, is the Forb Ecology Research Group at the Northwest University's Potchefstroom campus under the leadership of Professor Francis Siebert. And they have a whole list of different projects running in savannas and also grasslands to try and better our understanding of forb ecology. And I will briefly just refer to some of these projects. So some of them are looking at the effects of herbivory and fire on the recruitment attributes and also the below ground regeneration of forbs in African savannas. Some are looking at the pharmacological, phytochemical, and nutritional values of specific forb species. Others are looking at the carbon content of grassland forbs across various functional groups, and others are looking at the recruitment ecology of grassland forbs in South Africa. And then, of course, I'm also privileged enough to have been studying the ecology of herbaceous communities, particularly in nutrient hotspots in South African savannas. And then my postgraduate studies have focused on the dynamics of forbs and grasses in eutrophic sodic communities in a typically dystrophic savanna. So sodic patches are considered nutrient hotspots. And even though they are sparsely vegetated, as you can see here, the area within the yellow line depicts the sodic zone. The vegetation growing on sodic soil is particularly palatable and nutritious for herbivores, and that is why they are generally favored and intensely utilized by herbivores. And I thought I might add just some of the major findings of some of my research in the sodics, particularly pertaining to the forb component. So we found that herbaceous life forms reveal dynamic patterns of response to herbivory and rainfall variability and also fire. So the grasses and forbs, they respond dynamically to these environmental drivers. Forbs contributed significantly to species and functional diversity and richness, as I showed you before. Forbs promoted ecosystem resilience in these nutrient-rich patches, and they are functionally important during drought conditions because we found that palatable forbs competed well with the palatable grasses during drought conditions, so they are functionally important. And then forbs are taxonomically but also functionally important. I can now also continue my passion in developing forb ecology research in South Africa through my personal development program postdoctoral fellowship at SAEON under the mentorship of Dr. Dave Thompson. And keeping with the biogeochemical hotspot theme that I love so much, we are looking at the ecological legacy effects of megacarcasses in African savanna ecosystems. And the overarching question for this project is, how do megacarcasses influence terrestrial ecosystem processes? Because we know that large assemblages of herbivores create biogeochemical hotspots, and this is functionally important in creating dynamic landscapes of nutrient cycling, nutritious primary production, and enhanced species diversity. But these effects are not limited to living animals only, because we also know that mass mortalities of animals such as wildebeest or salmon create nutrient pulses, and these pulses have long-lasting legacy effects on the surrounding ecosystem. However, we know little about the effects of individual animal carcasses and how these nutrient pulses would affect the environment. Surprisingly, we know more about this phenomenon in marine ecosystems where whale megacarcasses deposit large pulses of carbon and nitrogen into the nutrient-poor deep sea, creating an oasis of production and biodiversity that persists for decades. But in a terrestrial context, we know little about how these nutrient pulses would affect ecosystem functioning, particularly when it comes to the African elephant, which is the largest land animal. And when these animals die, nutrients that get deposited into the soil can equate up to 800 kilograms of carbon, 300 kilograms of nitrogen, and 125 kilograms of phosphorus. So we are trying to figure out how these nutrient pulses would affect the surrounding environment. And in the Kruger National Park, where the mortality can total several hundred individuals annually, these nutrient pulses and also the impacts that they might have likely operate at a landscape scale. So we hypothesized that initially the surrounding area will be toxic for plants to grow, but increased plant productivity will be found at the older carcass sites. And yes, although this is a multidisciplinary study with soil scientists, entomologists, ecologists, and mammal specialists, my focus will be on the vegetation component, and then especially the herbaceous plant communities surrounding these carcasses. So I will be investigating the plant productivity and forage quality on these biogeochemical hotspots. We will be surveying and analyzing and comparing the vegetation dynamics, looking at forb grass interactions and also the plant functional traits. And we expect to see many forbs at these carcass sites. As you can recall from earlier, I mentioned that forbs have the ability to perform better under improved soil conditions. So we think that these nutrient pulses will be good for the forb community. And that is what we aim to quantify in this study. And as you can see, it's quite a jaw-dropping study. And I am very privileged to be a part of it and try to understand how these biogeochemical hotspots affect the herbaceous communities. And then I would just like to encourage you to go have a look at the various social media platforms that we have. Yeah, so you can go and follow the project there and see what we are up to. And I would like to thank everyone who joined me to listen to my forb story. And I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned something a little bit more about the less known plant life form of the herbaceous layer. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Helga. I think those people in SAEON who have known me for a while know that I am a fan of flowering plants. So this is really interesting. Yeah, let's open it up to questions. If anyone wants to find out more or pick your brain about anything, let's have that opportunity now. I see Rob Skelton has raised his hand. Do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead, Rob?
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Helga. That was a fantastic talk. I just wanted to check in about the dynamic function of forbs in your system. Can you explain what you mean by that and how you measured it?
Thanks, Robert, for the good question. So I think when I refer to the dynamic function of forbs, that's where the functional trait aspect comes in. So we will be looking at individual forb species found at the different carcass sites, and I am now busy compiling a functional trait database. And then we will be looking at different functional traits, for example, palatability, nitrogen fixing ability, spinescence, succulence, and traits like that pertaining to biogeochemical hotspots, to maybe tell us something about how the system can function with the presence of these different forb species that we find at the different carcass sites. So I hope that answers your question. You're welcome to ask again if I can maybe clarify a bit more.
Rob is happy. I see there's a question in the chat from Craig Morris. Craig, do you want to answer that, or should I read it out? Sorry, do you want to ask that? All right, Helga. Craig's comment is that forbs emerged long before the grasses in terms of evolution. So are forbs also adapted to herbivory?
Most definitely. Thanks, Craig, for the interesting question. Yes, we have found that forbs are definitely adapted to herbivory, and that comes in terms a lot of times in the life history trait, whether they are perennial or annual, and then also the growth form. So we also observed at some of the carcass sites closest to the what we call the grave site, the center of the carcass site, we would find a lot of prostrate growing forbs. In other words, growing close to the soil surface where they have been trampled a lot, maybe by the scavengers or the elephants that came to visit the site. So they have this adaptation for that by growing prostrate or close to the ground and not erect. Yeah, and that's just some of the adaptations. And then, of course, spinescence, or the presence or absence of spiny bracts, to also maybe deter some of the herbivores. So yes, there are definitely some herbivore adaptive traits that forbs possess.
So Craig is giving you a thumbs up. I think it's important there also to mention the below ground bud banks, Helga, and the ability of especially the more woody forbs to recover from above ground disturbance, whether it's from fire or herbivory.
Yes, absolutely. The presence of woody rootstocks, corms, tubers, any type of underground storage organ that allow them to resprout after the disturbance. Definitely. Thanks, Dave.
Any other queries or comments or suggestions for Helga? Doesn't look like it. All right. Just on behalf of the terrestrial ecologists, Helga, forbs, as you mentioned, are such an unknown and such a difficult group to work on. I think that the terrestrial people from the different systems would agree that sometimes we just don't work on them because there's just not enough resources and information available to even help us identify them. So I give you a lot of credit for really pushing this forward and trying to bring forbs into the limelight. So yeah, well done on some really great research.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, I'm just privileged to have been able to be a part of Francie's lab, and she instilled the passion on me, and it's a privilege to learn more about a less studied plant group, and it's just a lot of fun. It's difficult, but it's fun. But thank you for the compliment.
I see Michael raised a hand, but I think he put it down again. I wonder if he wanted to say something.
Hello, and thanks for the interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask if all these studies will be focusing only in conservation areas or protected areas, or are you also considering communal areas or areas where land tenure is actually under a communal management system for such studies?
Thank you, Michael. Yes, we have in the past done some research there at Belfast, where we actually compared a protected area with a communal area. So there is some research coming up, not only focusing on protected areas, which I think is very valid, because if we can teach the communal people how important forbs are as well, and how they can use it every day, would be great. But yeah, my focus has been more in protected areas, but there is definitely some research being done in communal areas too.
Maybe if I can just add a comment there. One of the big motivations behind Helga's or the bigger project on the mega carcasses is that savannas typically lose their big herbivores first when they are either mismanaged or given over to other land uses apart from conservation. And so what we're arguing, or what we're thinking, is that the loss of these big herbivores from a lot of savanna systems, including communal rangelands, is really speaking to an absence of a really critical biogeochemical hotspot that you can only really find in protected areas. And once we understand the function of that and the processes, it would be useful to try and figure out how we then replicate and perhaps restore those processes in areas where the mega herbivores are lost. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, thanks for that clarity. I also wanted to ask her if she's mostly going to focus on conservation area or protected areas. What are the drivers there is there any pressure that forbs tend to be under when in protected areas, and how do you factor in different management systems? Like for instance, if you were to look at how they manage population dynamics within these protected areas, factors like herbivory, how do they manage the carrying capacity? Is it always the same, or do you always have to factor into each and every analysis you make for each protected area? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. What pops into my mind now is the nucleus closures. That's where I did most of my previous postgraduate studies, and they control for herbivory as well as fire. So some of the areas were totally excluded from herbivores, and then we had a partial site which excluded elephants, and then we had an open area, and all of these sites were separated into a burn and a no burn block. So we were able to compare a lot of those factors. And then I think that's where the importance of long-term monitoring comes in, because we were privileged enough to have different rainfall years. So we had data for different rainfall years, below average, average, and above average. And then we could also ask a rainfall question or a climate question. So yeah, I think it's a valid and important question, and it's something that we should always keep in mind. But I think that's where the importance of long-term monitoring comes in, and then yeah, also exposure type experiments, and so that you can factor in for those different environmental conditions or factors or drivers.
A comment has popped up here. It says forbs are more diverse than grasses. If they are to be included in felt condition assessments, don't you think classifying them into ecological classes is an important and critical aspect to explore before being included in VCAs? Additionally, how practical is it while being cognizant of their temporal nature? Do you get that, Helga?
Dave, yeah, I think so. I think because they are relatively understudied, I think more questions are starting to come up. For example, one of my and Francie's honor students are looking at different land use types and how we can use forbs as indicator species for these land use types. Maybe for a pre-plowed or a natural grassland or urban spaces. So we are busy disentangling that. So yes, it is very important to classify them and maybe to use them as indicator species. I don't know if that answers maybe the first part, Dave, if you can maybe just assist. I don't know if I answered the first part.
So I think what we would want to say here is, and it links to the previous comment as well, where someone mentioned carrying capacity. So I think, yes, at some point down the line, we do want to include forbs in VCAs and calculations of carrying capacity, but we're not there yet. I think there's, as you mentioned, there's a lot more research that needs to be done to understand these dynamics. And I think at some stage you would want to get to a point where you combine the ecology and the traits, and you come up with sort of basic classifications as you have with grasses, like increases and decreases. You would want to have that kind of information available that you could then include forbs into these kinds of management activities.
Yes, thank you. That's worded very nice. I agree with that. And then additionally, how practical is it while cognizant of the temporal nature? Yeah, I think that's part of the dynamics of it all. Nothing's set in stone when it comes to vegetation. And like you said, temporally, there's a lot of variation. Sometimes there will be more annual species after a rainfall event, whilst during droughts, there will be more, you will maybe expect more perennials. So yeah, I guess that forms part of the dynamic nature of it all. But we should always keep that in mind. So it just, it makes it a little bit more difficult, but yeah, plants are dynamic. So like you said, we must just be aware of the dynamic nature of them when doing our studies.
All right, thanks. Let's see, there's one more message. I see Craig says they have actually done that, classifying forbs into increases and decreases, at least in mesic grasslands, and identified those that are particularly good for grazing. So that's a nice starting point, and now you can take that forward and do the same for savannas, Helga.
Yes, definitely.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, if there's no other questions, oh, there's one more just popped up from Tsumbedzo.
Will you also be looking at soil seed bank and how is megafauna carcasses affect, how does megafauna affect their viability? I'm not sure if you covered this. Oh, okay. There is potential for maybe an honest project to look at the soil seed banks. Yeah, so Tumbe, there's definitely potential for us to look at that. We were just a bit overwhelmed with all of the things that went on at the carcass site this year. So at least we've got next year up until mid-2025. So that is definitely something that is in our framework to try and do, definitely.
Okay, thank you, Helga, and thank you everyone for your engagement with the topic and with Helga. If anyone else has anything to comment on, let's do it now. Otherwise, I think oh, we've got another hand. Helga, you're not off the hook just yet. Go ahead, Lindo.
Hi, thank you for presentation. I quite like it, and I thought it's informative. And you mentioned the SAEON soil carbon, and that there is a team that will look into that. Do you have some specifics on what they will be looking at? I did go into the website that is showing here. it does show looking at soil carbon and looking at microbial activity, but I don't see anything on how that microbial activity that is expected, how it would affect the carbon fluxes and respiration. Is there anyone looking into that?
Thanks, Linda. Yes, that carbon project I referred to is one of Ferg's honors students that will be looking at the grassland forbs and at the carbon things pertaining to that. So I'm not directly part of that project. I just know of it. But for the carcass project, yes, we do have some people looking at the respiration of the soil. We have started analysis, but we haven't yet discussed the results, but we are looking at that.
Great, thank you. All right, let's I think let's let Helga off the hook now. Let her go and have a cup of tea. But yeah, thank you everyone. I just want to check quickly. I don't know, is Caitlin here? Caitlin, are you here?
Yeah.
I don't have my email open. Do you want to just
Okay.
share with us the details of the next seminar, please?
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Helga, and thank you, Dave. I hope, and thank you to everyone who joined. Hopefully we'll see you guys next month. So it'll be a little bit later. It'll be on the 14th of September, and Lucian from Alwandle is going to be chatting to us about some of his work. So hopefully we'll see you guys in just over a month's time.
Great. Thank you, Helga, and thanks, Caitlin, and thanks everybody. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.